The viewpoints expressed on Night Fright are not necessarily those of the host, the staff, the sponsors, or the affiliate stations. Tonight's program may contain graphic themes or images. Viewer discretion is advised.
There is a time for question. There is a time for answers. There is a time to challenge. There is a time to speculate. There is a time for change. There is a time for truth. The time is now. Welcome to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy. And now your host, Brent Holland.
Showtime. Welcome to the show. I'm Brent Holland, and welcome one and all to Night Fright. Tonight, we've got a great show for you. We continue with our JFK special with Dr. David Mantik. Just let me read a little bit about Dr. David Mantik. But first, I would be remiss if I didn't mention something about what took place earlier this week in Paris. And I just want to say to the French people, aujourd'hui, tout le monde en français. Aujourd'hui, tout le monde en solidarité et toujours. Aujourd'hui, tout le monde est libre. Vive les Français et vive la France. And basically, folks, that means today we are all French. Today we are all together and always. And today we are all free. The whole world is free. Long live France and long live the French people. And God bless you all. Dr. David Mantik has his doctorate in physics from the University of Wisconsin and radiation oncology at LAC, USC Medical Center in Los Angeles. He has also completed fellowships in physics at the University of Illinois and biophysics at Stanford University. And I'd like to give a shout out to my nephew who's studying in aerospace at Stanford. Hi, Ty. And a junior faculty clinical fellowship with the American Cancer Society. Dr. Mantik has carried out extensive research into the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Now, his research, folks, includes detailed studies of the Kennedy autopsy X-rays and the Zapruder film. As a matter of fact, in 1993, Dr. David Mantik disclosed that after examining the autopsy X-rays at the National Archives, that they indeed had been altered and that there were two shots which struck the head, and the magic bullet, folks, is anatomically impossible. Get the coffee going, get the tea going, get a beverage of your choice going, kick back in your most comfy chair, settle in, because we're going to go to the heart of it all, this magic bullet that's been bouncing around, or the Cirque du Soleil bullet, as I call it, coming from Montreal. Dr. David Mantik, welcome to the show all the way from California, where I'm sure it's probably nicer than it is here today, although it's not bad for November. How are you doing tonight, my friend?
Well, I'm doing great, and indeed it was a perfect day in Rancho Mirage.
Mazel tov, that's wonderful. Okay, let's jump in right away. You've got a brand new book out called J.F. Kennedy's Head Wounds, a final synthesis and a new analysis of the Harper fragment. I guess we should start off, and for those that are just joining us, when JFK was hit, a piece of his skull was launched out of the car onto Elm Street, the street that he was hit on. This fragment of his skull is now called the Harper fragment. And I'm going to turn it over to David to tell you more of the history and why this particular fragment is so essential to the narrative of John F. Kennedy. Dr. Mantik?
The Harper fragment was found not the day of the assassination, but the day afterwards. You know, this is strange in itself. Why did it take so long? It's over 24 hours after the event. Billy Harper found it in the infield grass in Dealey Plaza. This would be to the left of the limousine. And he found it in a place where it lay ahead of the limousine. So that made people think maybe it came from the top of his head or the front of his head, but based simply on where he found it. But in my book, I show that that's not a very logical conclusion. And we can list, which I did in the book, 15 clues as to where it came from. Well, here's what we know. The witnesses in Dealey Plaza and the doctors at Parkland Hospital all were really quite unanimous that there was a big hole in the back of JFK's head. Now, they didn't give us a measurement, but they did give us an approximation. Some said it was orange size, others said it was the size of a baseball. I'm talking about a Major League Baseball now, not a softball. The Harper fragment itself measures just a little over 2 inches in size, probably closer to 2.5 inches. Now, an American League, National League Baseball measures just under 3 inches, so that gives you a pretty good sense of how big this hole was. And as I said, virtually everybody at Parkland agreed on the size, and we're talking here about many, many doctors as well as other professionals. So they were all quite agreed that it was in the back of the head. Now, when I did my reconstruction based on all the evidence that we had available, including the x-rays, I placed it directly in the back of the head. So picture yourself, for example, lying on the floor, if you like, with your face straight up. The back of the head that's touching the floor would be exactly in the center of this Harper fragment. And that's really quite consistent with what the witnesses said as well. But I did this reconstruction based on the x-rays as well, and that's very important. So we have added information to what the witnesses said. Now we have other evidence that the Harper fragment was from the back of the head. While it was in Dallas, it was examined by 3 pathologists, and all 3 were quite confident that this indeed had come from the back of the head, and that's exactly what they said. About 20 years ago or so, I was on a talk show with one of these pathologists, and we quizzed him about this again, and he was absolutely adamant about all of this. He was quite convinced that it had come from the back of the head. Moreover, he said that there was one edge of it that had a smudge on it, as if it were a fragment or as if it had been placed there by a lead bullet. And we can still see that area today on the fragment. And I think that it really corresponds to where a bullet came in from the back, near the external occipital protuberance. So we have one headshot accounted for there. And that's one shot that the Warren Commission relied on very heavily. I think they were probably right in placing it at the back of the head. But then the next government investigation carried out by the House, that's the Congressional House, in the late 70s, put it in the back of the head, but they moved it up about 10 centimeters. So they really quite radically disagreed with the Warren Commission. So we have 2 different governmental bodies disagreeing by 10 centimeters, which is really quite a lot. That's like 4 inches.
David, how do you explain something like that? I mean, they're both looking at the same, I presume, autopsy x-rays and photos and drawings that were submitted to the Warren Commission. How do they come up with 2 completely different conclusions? I mean, 10 centimeters is a large amount, folks.
That's really a lot.
Yeah.
4 inches. So the Warren Commission relied not on photographs, but they relied on the pathologists who actually were at the autopsy. These guys had access to the skull. They could feel the notches in the skull. They could see all the evidence with their own eyes. And that's why I really rely much more on them. I think they were right. They placed it low in the back of the head, just above the external occipital protuberance, slightly to the right, about an inch to the right of midline. So when the next government investigation comes along, that's the House in the late 70s, they don't have the body. All they have are pictures. And unfortunately, these have been altered. So they were stuck. They were stuck. They could only deal with the evidence they had. It's most unusual for an autopsy to rely strictly on photographs. That's just unheard of. So this was quite an unorthodox procedure. So it's not surprising that they disagree, especially if you agree with me that the photographs of the back of the head had been altered. There's no big hole back there anymore when the house does its work. That hole is gone. It's just covered up with moist hair. It doesn't look as if there's much of anything amiss. So things had radically changed.
Any idea why the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and that was a committee, folks, that was put together by the House, of course, to investigate the assassination not only of President Kennedy, but also Dr. King and the governor, I forget his name, the racist governor. What a way to mention his name. But the shooting that took place with him as well. Why would they not rely on witness testimony as well and try and make the arc, try and make that, if you will, the evidence that they're presented with so many doctors coming out and saying there was a gaping hole. I had Dr. McClelland on the show, and you know, he was adamant and stern in the fact that there was this gaping hole in the back of the head that he stared down into. Certainly, the witnesses that said there was this hole were beyond reproach, because most of them were all the doctors and medical personnel that were working on JFK that day. Why would they not take that into account and perhaps just dismiss this misleading photo?
That's a nice summary. They were really in a difficult situation because the Warren Commission had placed this bullet entry low in the back of the head, and there was no evidence for that in the photographs. So what could they do? They were stuck. So they basically decided that they were not going to trust witnesses. They were going to be so-called, quote, scientific, end quote, about their investigation and leave the witnesses out of the picture. That way they were hoping to resolve this problem. But since the photographs had been altered and the x-ray has been altered too, which we'll get to, there was no hope for them to reach the right conclusion. They just did the best they could. Cyril Wecht, of course, disagreed with the result. He was one of only 9 pathologists who disagreed with their report, but unfortunately he didn't know what the original situation was either, so he didn't have the basic evidence to go on either. Now, when the autopsy photographs were reviewed, it was quite clear that the big hole that appears in one photograph, this is a different photograph from the one we mentioned before, it can't be positioned correctly. You can't orient it correctly because there aren't enough clues. However, the title for the photograph clearly says it's a view of the back. A view of the posterior is the word that's used. And if you accept that, which I do, then you really can put this all together and it all fits. The problem that the House had is they didn't really believe this anymore because they couldn't see it on the other photo. The photos were inconsistent with each other. One of the photos was authentic and the other one had been doctored, so you couldn't really put them together. So they were in a really tough situation. But anyway, the original catalog description does indeed have an autopsy photo that describes a big hole in the back of the head, and you can see it. Now, here's another big clue that I discovered. I was the first one actually to comment on this when I viewed these photographs at the National Archives. I took along with me a stereo viewer. Now, we have to remember that the autopsy photographs are taken in pairs. There are 2, basically, of each view, and they're not identical. They're just a little bit different, although you probably couldn't tell that if you looked at one and then the next one. But if you put both of them in the stereo viewer so that the left eye sees one and the right eye sees the other, you actually get a 3D picture. Some of your audience may remember from childhood having these stereo viewers, and it's really quite impressive how natural and effective this is. And it's the same way with the autopsy photographs. When you do the stereo viewing, the whole image just pops into 3D. So,
well, David, you just educated me because I had no idea that these were done with that stereo image in mind.
Yes. So you can see when you look at this authentic photograph just where the curvature of the skull is, and you can pretty well orient yourself. But there's one clue that just really made the case. In one corner of the stereo view, I could see fat pads. Now, the only place these could come from would be from the incision in the abdomen, in the chest, because we know that they sliced JFK open at the autopsy, and then they folded the fat pads back, and so that's what I was seeing. So I said, oh my goodness, nobody ever said this. But when you look at this photograph, in the distance there, you can see the fat pads. At the same time, you're looking at the back of the head, where the big hole is. So it all fit together. There is no way you could see the fat pads like that in that location unless you were looking from the back of the head, where I could see the big hole. So it all fit together. That proved to me that that was an authentic autopsy photograph, and that we were indeed seeing the big hole in the back of the head. Now, it's very interesting that when the Assassination Records Review Board came along in the 90s, that was the third government activity. I guess we can't call it an investigation because there was more information gathering than investigating. But anyway, the ARRB was very active in this whole area too, and they invited several experts to review the x-rays and the photographs. And one of them, Kirshner is his name, reported the same thing I had. I doubt that he had heard anything about my observations, but he made exactly the same point that I had in exactly the same area. So now we have a third person who's done it as well. Dr. Chesser, who will be speaking this coming Saturday with me in Dallas, earlier this year made the same observation. So now we now have 3 professionals who have observed fat pads in this corner, which clearly means only one thing. We can see the hole in the same photograph in the back of the head, just where it's supposed to be. So we've actually oriented this mystery photograph. Case closed, there's a big hole there, you can see it. Oh, that's just one of 15 clues that I presented that this hole was caused by the Harper fragment, which must have come from the back of the head.
Now, David, when you were looking at this in 3D, were you able to see that void, that missing piece, where it should have been, the Harper fragment where it should have been? Was that actually missing in those x-rays? Could you see that hole?
Now, we have been talking about the photographs. Now we're switching the conversation to the x-rays.
To the x-rays, right.
Okay. Just so your audience is aware. Right. We're switching gears here from photographs, which we've talked about. And now we're going to talk about the x-rays. Okay. So the question is, could I see this hole in the x-rays? Yes. And the answer is yes, but you have to be rather clever about it. On the frontal x-ray, we're talking about the x-ray taken from the front. You can see the lambdoid sutures on both sides. So I better describe what those are first, or we'll lose your audience. But the lambdoid sutures are on the back of the head, and they go from the midline to the both sides, and they're oblique in position. So they start up higher and they go down lower. So they make, you might say, a kind of a broad V in the back of the head, and you can see where they are on the X-rays, assuming they're there. These are places where the skull bones fuse together. We're all born, of course, with multiple bones in the skull, which are loose. This, of course, provides us the chance to get our heads through the birth canal. And if we didn't have loose skull bones, none of us might be here. We might not be able to make it out through the birth canal. So these skull bones are free-floating, and they fuse in early childhood. And of course, the size of the skull is a problem in birth for mothers today. And historically, we've lost a lot of women in childbirth because of this basic issue, including my great-grandmother back in the Ukraine. Oh. So on the frontal X-ray, we can see these lambdoid sutures, as I said, except now this is the key thing, except where the Harper fragment was. I don't see them there. Now, what impressed me as I reviewed this is I didn't realize at first, when I went to the archives, what a role the lambdoid sutures might play in this whole story. So I just wrote my notes out. I said, oh, I don't see them here anymore. I don't see them here anymore. It was only later that I realized, oh my gosh, that means there wasn't any bone there. That's where the Harper fragment probably lay. So that's a very powerful piece of evidence now from the X-rays, as opposed to the photographs. But the X-rays themselves are totally consistent with absent bone in that location. So that's quite striking. No one else has made that observation. But I have looked at these lambdoid sutures many, many times at the archives. I can never see them in that location. And that's just where the Harper fragment was and disappeared.
So you're lending your expertise to that, and that's essential, folks, is what I'm trying to get across. David, of course, is a renowned doctor, and he knows what he's talking about, folks. Now, to come back to the Harper fragment, because I'm very curious, when it was found, was there any tissue or anything like that attached to it?
No, it was just the bone. But it was a fresh bone, and the pathologists were quite convinced that this was fresh bone, and they all, really concluded that it had come from JFK based on where it was found and the fresh appearance as well.
Yeah, it would make sense. And it was just an accidental finding.
Yes. Yeah. Now, I have one more comment about the X-rays.
Yes, sir.
What we've said already is very powerful. We don't, on the frontal X-ray, we don't see the lambdoid sutures where that bone is gone, but we do see it very clearly on the sides of the head. So we have another clue, though, from the lateral X-ray. On the lateral X-ray, I did some optical density measurements along the back of the skull where that Harper fragment would be expected to lie. And I found an abrupt change in my measurements just where that hole started. That is, if you go along the top of the head and move down the back of the skull, taking one measurement after another, suddenly the measurements change. It's a total discontinuity because that bone's gone. It's no longer contributing to the measurements. So that's exactly what you'd expect. So we have confirmation then from the frontal X-ray, missing lambdoid sutures, and we have confirmation from the lateral X-ray, total abrupt change in continuity, just where that bone was gone. Now, we can't see with our eyes that it's gone. Our eyes are just not sensitive enough for that. That's why we have to resort to measurements. But the measurements are very clear-cut. There's a sudden change just where that bone disappears, and it continues on down, as you would expect it would. So double confirmation from the frontal X-ray and the lateral X-ray that the Harper fragment, or at least that bone is gone, and I think that's where the Harper fragment fits. There's no other good place for it. That's another whole story, but everything fits together.
Dr. David Mantik's our guest tonight, folks. He has a new book out I'd encourage you all to get. This is the science behind proving that there was indeed two shooters. The book is called J.F. Kennedy's Head Wounds, a Final Synthesis, and a New Analysis of the Harper Fragment. www.nightfrightshow.com, www.nightfrightshow.com. Just click on the book cover that's there tonight, and that'll take you right to a spot where you can order it, as always, from the comfort of your own home. Now, a couple of things. That governor's name was Wallison, I think. Bill in Nevada for that. Thanks, Bill. And also, I wanted to mention Deborah Conway puts on this wonderful, wonderful conference every year, and she's done so dutifully since the early 90s, and it's called JFK Lancer, and it's probably the most reputable and biggest conference that's put on in Dallas every November 22nd, in and around there. And she brings in all the top-notch researchers, and David is part of that this year as well. So I would encourage you, check out jfklancer.com for more information on that. I know there's tickets still available. I was there on the 50th anniversary, and she just puts on an incredible conference. And as I said, all the top-notch folks are there all the time, and David is certainly going to be there talking about various subjects. You'll learn a lot by going there, so definitely I wanted to plug that without question. Let's go back to David now. David, you had mentioned that there was a possibility of two shots coming into the head, one from the back and one from the front, I'm suspecting. Is it possible the shot, let me rephrase, Is there any way that occipital piece of Harper fragment could have dislodged itself without a frontal shot? In other words, could a back shot have caused it to jump out and land behind JFK?
That's a very good question. Let me insert some comments and we'll come directly back to that. But I was wondering if you knew who the running mate was for George Wallace when he was running for president.
I do, actually. I wasn't aware of this. I had interviewed Ted Sorensen, as you know, and Sorensen told me it was General LeMay. What is that about? Could you imagine those two on the same ticket?
Yeah, very exciting.
God. And we think we have problems now.
Yes.
Oh, man.
I want to emphasize that at the Dallas meeting, Dr. Chesser will be speaking as well, as I mentioned before. But this is very important to have corroboration for my own measurements after 20 years. Finally, this is a long wait. It shouldn't have taken this long. But Dr. Chesser will be speaking right after me. So we'll have a chance there to compare notes, and the audience will have a chance to see some amazing things that we are not even going to talk about on this show based on the X-rays. Dr. Chesser has made some remarkable discoveries as well. But on to your point. Do you want to just rephrase it for your audience?
Sure, I'd be happy to. We've been talking about the Harper fragment, folks, and the Harper fragment comes from the back of JFK's head. It was found on the street, just as a summary, the next day after the assassination by a fella who has a last name called Harper. It's only about maybe this big, 2 inches. But the important point is it comes from the back of his head. And my question to Dr. Mantik is it possible for that piece to be dislodged from the skull and end up behind JFK without a frontal shot? Because don't forget, folks, the Warren Commission has stated over and over and over again that there was no frontal shot. All the shots coming into JFK and everywhere else were all from the rear. So I'll turn it over to David Mantik now.
Well, I think it's fair to say that we cannot say with 100% certainty that that scenario is impossible, but it's very unlikely. Besides, we have more evidence to bear on this question. We have many witnesses who saw a bullet strike just in front of JFK's right ear, and I list all of those in the book. This is a very impressive list of witnesses, just a very short distance in front of the right ear. There are the witnesses who were standing very close to the limousine on the right side, who reported that they saw something there, including Zapruder.
That's right.
Then we have James Jenkins at the autopsy, who said he actually saw a small entry wound at that location with a smudge of lead, which he interpreted to be the entry of a bullet at that site. Now, the pathologist didn't report this, of course, but they were locked into a one-shot from the rear scenarios, so they did everything they could to avoid that. So what else could have knocked the Harper fragment out other than a frontal shot? Well, I believe now, and this is a change from where I was some years ago. Several years ago, I thought there were two shots. One that entered from the rear, as we discussed at the beginning of the show, just above the external occipital protuberance. That's low in the back of the head, just to the right of midline. So that's one. The Warren Commission agreed with that. Then I thought we had to have a frontal shot based on the X-rays, because we see a bullet fragment trail high on the X-rays.
That's right.
It's very consistent with a shot coming in very near the hairline, above JFK's right eye, actually near the lateral aspect of the right eye.
Okay.
So we have many witnesses who describe just such an entry based on what they saw at the autopsy, but also several witnesses who saw autopsy photographs with a shot with a bullet entry at that site. But what's uncanny to me about it, it's totally consistent with what we see on the X-rays. We see a bullet fragment trail totally consistent with that shot. what else is interesting is that the bullet fragments are clustered near the front of the skull, not the back. And that's very important because it strongly suggests that the bullet came from the front, not from the rear. We know from ballistics that a bullet that fragments and breaks up into so many little pieces does not travel very far. And it's expected that the fragments would be clustered toward the front, and that's exactly what we see. Why that wasn't noted and reported by the House or by the Warren Commission, well, we probably let the Warren Commission off. They didn't focus on the x-rays. But the House certainly should have noticed that and reported on it, but they didn't. So anyway,
David, what's your speculation on that? Did they not hire competent people? I thought they had.
But they were all locked into this one shot from the rear scenario. And I think they were afraid, politically and personally, to break out of that scenario. But, you know, if you're not in that locked up situation, then it's obvious that those bullet fragments are consistent with a shot from the front, came in near the hairline, and then just went only a short distance into the skull. So that's one headshot. That's what I believed for many years. But I was always uneasy with that because the bullet fragments are clustered near the front of the skull. So how could that shot knock a bone out of the back of the head? It didn't fit together at all. But if there had been a shot near the right ear, an oblique shot, that could easily fit with knocking a Harper fragment out of the back of the head. So that's what I now believe. But that's a third headshot now.
Wow.
So we have 3 headshots. One in the forehead near the hairline, then one coming in near the right ear that knocked out the Harper fragment. And then we also have the shot from the rear. And in the ebook, I don't try to discuss what sequence these shots came in. We may still be able to sort that out, but that's a tough challenge. And we can all speculate. I hope that maybe we can get a little more clarity on that in the near future. But in the book, I did not want to take that on. But anyway, we do have 3 shots. And in the book, there's just one table 1, in which I list a lot of evidence. And I tick off column by column which shot the evidence supports. No one's done that before. It's like taking a sieve and sifting through all the evidence. And it's amazing how it fits together. You can find the evidence that fits with the forehead shot that doesn't fit with the shot to the ear and vice versa. It really all finally makes sense. And if you look at the witnesses too, and what they recall, that also makes a huge amount of sense. Now I should take care here to say that I'm not the first one to bring this up. Doug Horn actually presented the same scenario in his big 5-volume set of books based on his experience working for the government or the Assassination Records Review Board. So Doug actually presented this first. So I was slow on the uptake in putting this together. But Doug appreciates what I've done since with the additional evidence to support his perspective. And we are now quite sure that this really does fit with everything. And if you don't take this point of view, you have major problems explaining the evidence.
Why this is essential, folks, is because science has taken over now at this point and has proven a frontal shot. And why that's essential is because, as I said before, the official report, and from the time Kennedy was killed till now, the mainstream media, the government, everybody maintains that it was one lone assassin by the name of Lee Harvey Oswald shooting from behind President Kennedy. Now science has proven that no, there was multiple shots and a frontal shot. And what that means is at least 2 shooters. And what 2 shooters means is conspiracy. So Dr. David Mantik is added to the evidence that is going to prove and break this case wide open that mainstream media can no further ignore the fact that there was 2 shooters, and by definition, a conspiracy.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Dealey Plaza, first-person witness accounts. Order yours right now. nightfrightshow.com.
Dr. David Mantik's our guest tonight, folks. New book out. He's got John F. Kennedy's Head Wounds, a final synthesis, and a new analysis of the Harper fragment. We've been talking about that all evening long. Easy way to get his book, www.nightfrightshow.com, www.nightfrightshow.com. I had mentioned Dr. Robert McClelland was also on the show, who had worked on JFK when he was fatally wounded. That is in the archives. All the shows are free. www.nightfrightshow.com. Nobody makes a dime off this show. I'm a volunteer, so there's no worries there. And Dr. David Mantik does not drive or is driven by a private airplane, or he has no chauffeur. He does all this research out of his own pocket, and I commend him for that. He's just a true patriot, and he wants the truth to come out about the murder of the President of the United States. And as Abraham Bolden says, the first African-American Secret Service agent, it was an attack on the Constitution. And that's why it's important. It was an attack on the American people themselves. So that's why it's important to get to the truth. Let's go back to Dr. David Mantik. Now, there's all kinds of evidence now that is starting to prove. I know you're aware of Sherry Feaster's work. You're aware of some great work by Paul Chambers, the NASA physicist, the science, and David Lifton. Do you pretty much agree with their thesis that there was a frontal shot, perhaps emanating from the southern knoll, or is that beyond the scope of your book?
I have not focused very much on where the shot came from.
Fair enough.
But I cannot rule out that possibility, especially the forehead shot. It all depends on what direction JFK was faced. And I can't rely on the Zapruder film, which other people seem to think they can. So this makes the problem even more difficult.
And David, I wanted to ask you also, a big part of David Lifton's thesis is the fact that there was an autopsy performed before the official autopsy. Do you think that a lot of the evidence was bastardized and destroyed in a prior autopsy to the official autopsy?
Well, we have a list of 8 physicians at Bethesda who basically describe the same wounds that JFK had at Dallas.
Okay.
So if something happened, it happened after he first arrived. But Doug Horne has proposed that it was Humes himself who intervened.
I didn't know that.
So he has changed Lifton's thesis, or the location of this event. He has placed it directly in the morgue, or at least next door to the morgue, with Humes as the main character.
Bill, let me ask you, how do you feel about David's research so far?
Well, I had known of it, so it's just confirming. I have, followed along on his theories and what he's has investigated, and he's one of the few people. He's been to the National Archive and looked at the texts more than anyone else in the world. So he knows what he's talking about, and so I hope we haven't lost him.
No, I hope so too. He seems to have disappeared, but I'm going to try and drag him back in right now, and we'll see if that'll work. Folks, if you're just joining us, you're listening to Night Fright. I'm your host, Brent Holland. www.nightfrightshow.com is our website. You're also listening on Revolution Radio. Our guest tonight is David Mantik, and he's got a new book out called JFK's Head Wounds, a final synthesis and a new analysis of the Harper fragment. And Dr. David Mantik, of course, has his doctorate in physics from the University of Wisconsin and radiation oncology, which puts him a step above all the other people that have been looking at the x-rays, because he actually knows what he's looking at. And that's from the LAC-USC Medical Center in Los Angeles. Now listen to this. He's also completed his fellowships in physics at the University of Illinois and biophysics at Stanford University, and a junior faculty clinical fellowship with the American Cancer Society. He's spent since 1993 investigating the JFK assassination, and that's all done on his own initiative. Once again, there's no money or research funds behind any of these researchers that we have on. These are all authentic people, folks, and they put their books out. They probably won't even make a dime off it. They'll probably be lucky, as in my case, to maybe even break even. And I'm still $2,500 in the hole on my book, but I felt it was important to get that information out there. And there's David. Look at him, and he looks good. Doesn't he look good, folks? I should have put a tie on in his honor. Welcome back, David. When we left, you had asked me a question, and my response to that question was essentially, the question was, folks, I'll rephrase the question, essentially, why would there be an autopsy before the autopsy? What was he poking around, Dr. Humes, who was a pathologist, what was he doing poking around inside the head of JFK? My response, David, if you didn't hear it, was obviously, I think the only reason would be to try and dig out evidence, bullet fragments, maybe bastardize the fact that by taking sections of the brain out, so trajectories couldn't be aligned and things of that nature. What is your perspective, my friend?
Well, we agree. He had to remove the bullet fragments that suggested a second shot or even a third shot. Yeah. He absolutely had no choice. He knew that was the goal of the autopsy, to show that there was only one shooter and then that he was shooting from the rear. So that was his goal. It wasn't to change the brain or change the body. It was simply to remove the most critical evidence of bullet fragments. Now, what makes us think that there were other bullet fragments there? Well, we have lots of evidence for that, amazingly enough. Dennis David, for example, that evening was handed bullet fragments that he said represented more than one bullet total, possibly as many as two. And he typed up a report to that effect, which he was asked to do. James Jenkins, who was standing right next to JFK's body during the autopsy, said he saw a plastic bag with bullet fragments placed on the autopsy table right next to JFK's head. He said that repeatedly. Tom Robinson, who was standing there in the morgue, he was one of the morticians, said he saw removal of multiple bullet fragments from the brain. So that's three pieces of evidence. There's even a fourth. There's an FBI memo from Alan Belmont, who was one of the top-ranking FBI people. This memo was going to Hoover, saying that they had found a bullet, and that's apparently what he said, a bullet rather than bullet fragments, behind JFK's right ear. So there's a fourth piece of evidence. And of course, there was nothing like that in the autopsy. Where'd that come from? Well, that may have been based on some actual information before he was officially supposed to know about it. And then there's the fifth clue. James Humes, in his official autopsy report, describes a bullet trail coming from that posterior shot we discussed before, just above the EOP. He says there's a bullet trail coming from there going forward and upward, but it's not on the X-ray. Well, maybe it really was there and he took all those fragments out. So now you may ask, how is he so sure that he could get them all out? Well, he had X-rays, didn't he? How many X-rays did he have? Did he have enough X-rays to prove that he got them out? Well, maybe he did, because we know from Gerald Custer, the X-ray technician, that Gerald took 2 or maybe 3 sets of skull X-rays. What kind of sense does this make? Unless Humes is using it to prove that he's getting all the right pieces out. Gerald is not the only one who said they took multiple skull X-ray sequences. I'm not talking about multiple X-rays. I'm talking about sequences of X-rays with long periods of time between sequences. Gerald Custer had to go to an upper floor at the Naval's Medical Center to develop his X-rays. That took time to travel and actually develop the films. So during that time, Humes could look at the first set of X-rays, which were posted publicly for viewing, and decide exactly where he needed to dig around a little more to get the rest out. Then Custer comes back with the next set. He looks again. He's got another chance if he needs to. People don't realize this, but that's what Gerald Custer said. And he's not the only one who said that. I spoke directly to Gerald Custer. I spoke directly to the radiologist, John Ebersol. He said the same thing. And these guys weren't talking to each other after that weekend. There was no communication. These are two independent reports.
Do these guys have any idea what happened to all these X-rays? Because as far as I know, we only have the final set, right? We have one set. And
we don't have all the X-rays. Yeah, that's pretty clear. Both Ebersol and Custer say they took at least 5 or 6, maybe even more, skull X-rays. There are only 3 now that are left. So obviously some disappeared. So both Custer and Ebersol said the same thing basically to me. I mean, this is a personal report. I spoke to the people who were there. This is not speculation.
No, exactly.
So we have only 3 left there. So there was time for Humes to do that. So what happened to the report that Dennis David typed up? It doesn't exist anymore. What happened to those bullet fragments that were placed in the plastic bag by JFK's head? Well, they vanished. We don't have those either. So everything disappeared. There's no Belmont bullet either. And the bullet trail that may have been there initially, the one Humes actually put in the report, that one doesn't exist. He was quite embarrassed when the ARB asked him about that in the 1990s, because obviously his report was wrong. At least the way it looks now, the X-ray doesn't support that. But it may have been there initially.
Let me just ask Bill a question, because Bill's an accomplished attorney. Bill, in a situation like that, would you have any idea who would be responsible, who would normally be responsible for handling those bullet fragments? Would it be the FBI, perhaps?
Well, in the autopsy itself, it's going to be the autopsy doctor. You're going to have a chain of possession. That's going to be logged in on the login sheet. That's going to be those.
But all the evidence was taken from the doctors and given to the Secret Service.
Oh, the Secret Service.
Yeah.
Roy Kellerman's charge.
So you in a normal thing, you're going to have a chain of possession documented. Those things are going to be, the bullet fragments are going to be put into plastic bags. Those are going to be sealed. They're going to be initialed, and they're going to move up the chain wherever that chain goes. And whoever gets that bag is going to sign off on that as well, initial it. And this wasn't done.
And they've disappeared. Now I'm wondering, I'm going to go back to David now. David, do you feel that if they were destroyed, that's destroying evidence, isn't it? I mean, that's criminal charges. That's big time fraud and everything else that goes along with it.
Yeah, I don't suppose the government is supposed to do that, is it?
No, not really. Now, many people speculate that you had mentioned General LeMay. Do you think General LeMay perhaps was involved in orchestrating some of that autopsy that day?
Well, one of the autopsy technicians says that he was he was asked to go to the audience. There were quite a few people seated there watching the autopsy, and asked the one fellow who was a high-ranking military official to stop smoking a cigar. And as he approached him, he realized who it was, and he didn't say anything.
He would have been shipped off to Alaska pretty darn quick if that was LeMay.
That only fits Curtis LeMay, of course.
Yeah. The other odd thing about Curtis LeMay, folks, he was in charge of SAC at the time, and he was in Canada when the assassination took place, and he flew back afterwards. Now, many people can speculate, why would a general of SAC be in Canada and coincidentally an assassination of the President of the United States take place? I'll let you draw your own conclusions. But the whole thing is very, very strange what took place that day. There's no question. David, the evidence is so sparse. We're missing critical pieces. And yet you've been able to come and prove scientifically and given us a much clearer picture of what's taken place. The only thing left is disclosure, and disclosure has to come from mainstream media. It's fine and I really do appreciate you coming on the show. It's fine for you to do shows like mine and others. There's some serious others. But when are the Charlie Roses going to step forward? When are the Anderson Coopers going to step forward and say, wow, we've got some scientific evidence now that proves a frontal shot, 2 shooters, conspiracy?
Well, that's an easy question to answer. They will come forward when they're no longer afraid of losing their jobs.
Yeah, I can see that completely. Does it irritate you every time you see the Bugliosis and the Posners get their 20 minutes and then you see poor Mark Lane gets 30 seconds in documentaries?
Well, yes, it does, of course, but perhaps not as much as it did 15 or 18 years ago.
I thought things would have changed since then, I thought, the movie JFK, for all it's worn well. I mean, what it did, I think it's the most important film of the 20th century because it actually got the government to do something and release those files. And
that was a trigger for my involvement too.
Mine as well. Yeah. So Oliver Stone did himself a big credit there. Bill, are there any questions you would like to ask David? We've only got a few minutes left, and I didn't want to ignore you.
Yeah. Well, hi, Dr. Mantik. We got cut off there because of volume control. We were in the radio station together that day. I had got a hold of Billy Harper about 2 months before. Dr. Carnes, who was the pathologist that was on the air that day that you got to talk with, somebody there had the Carcana rifle and was showing us how you took it apart and how long it was. And I always thought that was you that did that.
No, I would not have that expertise. So someone else.
Okay, well, someone there had it. So, but it was a great afternoon. And again, I just wanted to say hello to you.
Thank you very much. That was a great show. I remember it well.
That's great. Thanks for that, Bill. David, what's next for you after the conference? Are you going back and doing more research or doing perhaps a book tour? Anything along those lines that you'd like to promote?
I don't anticipate a book tour, but I do have a few more questions that I really would like to answer at the National Archives. There are a few more images I'd like to look at. One of them in particular, how much time do we have left? Shall we leave our audience
we've got
in anticipation, or shall it take a minute?
It's up to you. We've got 3 minutes. It's up to you, my friend.
Okay, we can do it then. In the photographs, JFK at the autopsy is lying on his back, and his head is on a metal brace. These are public images. Anyone can look at them.
Yeah.
That is not what any of the autopsy personnel remember. None of them recognized the metal brace. They all claim that they used a block, not a brace. So it occurred to me, you know what? If we look at the x-rays carefully, we might be able to tell which one it is. And if his head's not on a brace in the x-rays, that's going to blow up a huge storm of controversy.
No kidding, because that'll show probably the first autopsy that took place, as opposed to the second one where the block was used.
There's something wrong in D.C. in that case.
No kidding. No kidding. Folks, we've been speaking with David Mantik. I urge you all to get his book, and without question. It's going to answer a lot of questions you've probably been asking yourself, and it's scientific proof of a conspiracy. How so? Well, he's just proved scientifically there was a frontal shot. 2 shooters by nature, by definition, a conspiracy. The book is called John F. Kennedy's Head Wounds, A Final Synthesis and a New Analysis of the Harper Fragment. Our guest tonight and its author, Dr. David W. Mantik, www.nightfrightshow.com. click on tonight's guest book cover. That'll take you right to a spot where you can order the book from the comfort of your own home. David, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Brent. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, it's been wonderful for us too. Thank you so much for informing us all, and thank you so much for your work. I mean, that's a solid body of work, my friend. That's a lifetime of work, and I have to pat you on the back for that. That's something else.
We'll carry on.
Thank you, my friend. Have fun
Good night.
in Dallas.
I will.
Okay. You take care, my friend. Have a good night.
Good night.
I'm Brent Holland from Night Fright. See y'all later.
You're listening to Night Fright and your host, Brent Holland. The time is now. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Dealey Plaza, first-person witness accounts. Order yours right now. nightfrightshow.com.